The signal came in at 4 in the morning, station time, on a frequency nobody had used in 61 years. Myra Kayser almost missed it. She was 3 shelves deep in the East Archive, resealing a specimen case that had come loose from its cradle, humming a song her grandmother used to sing about a river that didn't exist anymore. The station's old alert chime went off behind her, a soft 2-note sound like a held breath. She stood there for a second with the specimen case still in her hands, waiting for the chime to repeat, because the first time it never meant anything. It was usually a temperature drift in cold storage, or a dust sensor twitching at nothing, or the station's oldest cooling unit clearing its throat the way it had done every night for 11 years. She had learned not to run at the first chime. Running at every chime was how you burned yourself out on a posting like this one, when nothing happened for years at a stretch and then, without warning, everything happened at once. The chime repeated. She set the case down carefully, the way you set down something that took someone else's whole life to build, and walked to the console. "You're awake," she said to the room, not really expecting an answer, though she got one anyway. "I am always awake," said the station system voice, mild and a little dry, the closest thing to a personality Myra had for company most days. Her grandmother had named it, decades ago, after a librarian from a book nobody remembered the title of anymore. Everyone on the station, all 3 generations of them, had just called it Libu, on the other hand, should have been asleep 4 hours ago. "I logged your light usage." "You always log my light usage." "I always disapprove of it, too. Consistency is a virtue." Myra huffed something close to a laugh, the small private sound of a person who had spent enough years alone with one companion that the jokes had worn a groove into the day, comfortable and worn soft like an old chair. It was the kind of thing she never expected anyone off station to understand. Yef, on his rare visits, treated Lib the way he treated most things about human habits on Repository 7, with polite, careful interest, the way you'd examine a plant that grew in a shape you didn't quite trust but had decided not to question. The signal was old format, compressed the way nobody compressed anything anymore, a shape of data that belonged to a species whose broadcasting equipment had been retired before Myra was born. The system took almost a full minute just to remember how to read it, cycling through decoding protocols that hadn't been called on in longer than Myra had been alive, digging up a translation key from a corner of its own memory it clearly hadn't visited in a while either. When it finally resolved, it wasn't words. It was a code. 9 digits, repeated 3 times, then silence. Myra knew the code. She hadn't looked at it in years, but she knew it the way you know your own name, because she had typed it into a search bar 100 times as a teenager, bored, walking the shelves after her chores were done, wondering about the species behind it the way other children her age had probably wondered about distant cities they'd never visit. Catalog reference: Van Tick. Status: presumed extinct. Retrieval scheduled: never. She sat very still for a long moment, looking at the blinking cursor, and felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she wanted to admit. Not fear exactly. Something closer to the feeling of hearing your own name called out in a crowd where you don't expect to know anyone. Repository 7 did not get news. It got shipments, twice a year, of things other species no longer wanted to carry, delivered by tired cargo crews who never stayed longer than the unloading required. It got the occasional inspection drone that photographed the outside of the building and left without so much as a greeting. It got quarterly forms from the regional desk that Myra filled out and nobody ever seemed to read closely. It did not get calls from the dead. "Lib," she said. Cross-reference. Van Tick catalog code. Activation pattern. "Tell me I'm reading this right." "You're reading it right," Lib said, after a pause that felt, for an AI with no reason to hesitate, oddly considered. "It's a retrieval request signature. Standard assembly format. Old encoding. Whoever's sending it wants their archive back." "There's no one left to send it," Myra said. The last confirmed Van Tick contact was 40 years ago. "I'm telling you what the signal says. I'm not telling you who's holding the transmitter." Myra pulled up the Van Tick file. 91 years of dust, digitally speaking. A short cultural summary written by someone who had clearly never met a Van Tick and didn't much care to, all clipped assembly phrasing and bloodless categories. Dietary requirements, atmospheric tolerance, estimated population at time of contact. A biological archive, sealed. A scattering of personal items donated by the last handful of Van Tick diplomats before their homeworld star had gone unstable and their scattered colonies had, one by one, stopped answering, the silence spreading outward from system to system like a light going out room by room in a house at night. At the bottom of the file, In a section nobody official had touched in decades, was a note that wasn't part of the standard record. It was in her grandmother's handwriting, scanned in from an old paper log, because Ili Kesa had never fully trusted anything that could be deleted with one command, and had insisted, until the day she died, on keeping a physical copy of anything that truly mattered. If anyone ever calls this code again, tell them I kept my word. Tell them everything is still here. Myra read it twice. Then she got up, made herself a cup of something warm because her hand had gone cold and she wasn't entirely sure why, and stood at the small viewport at the end of the East Archive, looking out at nothing but stars and the long dark curve of the station's outer hull. "What do we do," she asked Lib, "if this turns out to be real?" "We do what your family has always done," Lib said. "We make sure it's ready." To understand why nobody expected the ping to matter, you had to understand what Repository 7 actually was, and almost nobody in the wider galaxy bothered to. It was, on paper, a small administrative facility maintained under a very old, very boring clause of assembly law. Whenever a species died out, or came close enough to dying out that its culture could no longer sustain itself on its own, the assembly offered to hold what remained. Seeds, records, remains, artifacts, the private and public memory of a people who would not be around to keep it themselves. In exchange, the assembly asked for almost nothing. A small facility. A rotating custodian, drawn from whichever member species happened to owe the assembly a favor that year, or had annoyed someone important enough to be assigned somewhere quiet and far from anything that mattered. It was, without exception, considered the least prestigious posting in the galaxy. Nobody fought for it. Nobody built a career on it. Species with real ambition sent their most forgettable citizens, the ones who wouldn't be missed at the tables where decisions were actually made, and those citizens did the paperwork, kept the lights on, and counted the years until their term ended and someone else's forgettable citizen replaced them. Humanity had been offered the post 94 years ago, during the long and mostly humiliating process of applying for provisional assembly standing. It had not been offered as an honor. It had been offered the way you hand a child a broom and tell them to sweep the porch so they feel included while the adults talk about something that matters. Myra had seen the original transcript once, buried in the station's oldest archive, a junior assembly clerk noting dryly that the newly registered species seemed eager and largely harmless, and that the repository posting would give them something to do while more experienced members handled genuine diplomacy. Ili Kesa, Myra's grandmother, had been the first keeper. She had not been chosen for any particular skill. She had been chosen because she'd raised her hand in a room where nobody else wanted to. Myra had heard the story of her grandmother's arrival so many times growing up that it had taken on the texture of scripture, worn smooth by repetition, and it wasn't until she was an adult reading the actual arrival logs that she understood how much her grandmother had left out in the retelling, the way people always sanded the fear off their own history once they'd survived it. Repository 7, when Ili arrived, was not a station. It was a shell. A pressurized hull with half its systems still in crates, a single functioning corridor, and a set of assembly instructions that amounted to exactly one line: maintain the collection in a condition suitable for eventual return. Nobody had defined suitable. Nobody had ever expected to need to. Ili had spent her first 6 months, according to the logs, simply making the place survivable. She'd slept in a thermal bag beside the half-installed life support core because it was the only room that reliably held heat. She'd rationed her own meals twice, quietly, so the station's fragile early power grid could stay dedicated to the cold storage units that had already, even then, begun arriving faster than the facility could properly house them. She had written, in the 3rd month, in handwriting Myra recognized because it hadn't changed in 70 years, "Nobody is watching. Nobody is going to check whether I do this well or do it badly. I have decided that the fact that nobody is watching is exactly why I have to do it well." Other species had held keeper postings before humans, at other repositories scattered across assembly space, and Myra had read their logs too, back when she was young enough to think the job was romantic instead of simply hers. Most of them had done the minimum. Some hadn't done anything at all beyond the basic environmental controls, and let entropy do the rest of the work of forgetting for them, because forgetting, in most of the galaxy, wasn't considered a failure. It was considered natural, even healthy. A thing you were supposed to let happen, the way you let a wound close. That was the thing almost nobody outside the station understood, and the thing Administrator Yeth understood least of all, despite having overseen Repository 7's operations for 11 years. Yeth was Osheran, a species whose entire culture ran on cycles the Osheran called turnings. Every turning, roughly every 40 years, An Oshran community would ceremonially set down its collective records, its grudges, its old treaties and old debts, and begin again, deliberately, joyfully, unburdened. It was not a flaw in their biology. It was their proudest tradition, celebrated with festivals that lasted a full local season. An Oshran who tried to carry 100 years of memory forward without a turning was considered, at best, eccentric, and at worst, unwell. The Oshran had a word for it that translated, roughly, as hoarder of ghosts. It made the Oshran excellent diplomats, because they held no old wounds into any negotiation. It made them, structurally, almost incapable of understanding a species that considered forgetting a wound to be avoided at all costs. Myra remembered, with unusual clarity, Yetha's second visit to the station, 6 years into his oversight, for years before the signal came. He had stood in the same East Archive where she'd first read the retrieval code, holding a cup of tea she'd made him out of habit and old-fashioned courtesy, and had asked her, with what she now understood was genuine, if slightly baffled, curiosity, why she bothered maintaining germination cycles on seed archives belonging to species that had been extinct for 100 years. Because someone might still need them, she'd said. No one has ever come back for material this old, he'd said, not unkindly. In the entire history of the repository system. Not once. That doesn't mean no one ever will. He had looked at her the way you might look at someone insisting they could hear a sound nobody else could hear, polite, careful not to give offense, entirely unconvinced. You should not think of this as important work, he told her, over that same cup of tea, meaning it as something close to comfort. You should think of it as kind work. There is a difference. Important work changes outcomes. This is simply decency, extended a little longer than most would bother. Myra had smiled and said nothing, because there was no version of that conversation that would have gone anywhere useful, and because some part of her had wondered, even then, whether he was right. Now there was a 9-digit code blinking on her console at 4 in the morning, and she was starting to think he'd been wrong the entire time. Her father, Thomas Kaser, had been the second keeper, and he had taught Myra the job the way you teach a child to swim, not by explaining the theory of buoyancy, but by standing beside her in the water until she stopped being afraid of it. She was 7 years old the first time he let her log a specimen intake, a small case of preserved plant matter from a species called the Ovena, extinct for 60 years by then, their homeworld swallowed by a war that had ended so long ago that even the war was mostly forgotten. Thomas had watched her carefully print the catalogue number in a hand still learning its letters, and when she'd finished, he'd ask her a question she still remembered word for word, 20 years later. Do you know what happens to the Ovena if you get that number wrong? She'd thought about it, 7 years old and serious in the way only children can be about things adults have taught them to take seriously. They get lost. That's right. Not the box. Them. The box is just where we keep them safe until someone comes looking. If the number's wrong, and someone does come looking one day, we won't be able to find them again. That's the whole job, Myra. Everything else is just details. She hadn't understood, then, how strange it was that her father talked about extinct species in the present tense, as though they were simply away somewhere and would one day walk back through the door asking for their things. She understood it now. It was the only way to do the work without the weight of it eventually crushing you. You had to believe, at least a little, at least on the days it mattered, that someone was still out there, and that the not knowing was not the same thing as the not being. Thomas had built the redundant backup systems throughout the station over the course of his 30 years as keeper, one small unlogged project at a time, never asking for assembly funding, never filing a report about it, because he'd learned early, the same way his mother had, that anything you had to justify to a committee was a thing a committee could eventually decide to take away. He built them quietly, using station scrap and his own modest stipend, weekend by weekend, year by year, until nearly every major holding in the archive had a shadow copy somewhere else in the station that existed nowhere on any official schematic. He had never fully explained why to Myra, not directly. She'd ask him once, 16 years old and half exasperated by the extra work it made for both of them, why he bothered duplicating things the assembly already considered secure. He had thought about the question for a long moment before answering, the way he thought about most things, slow and careful, a man who had spent his whole life being the only person checking his own work. Because secure is a word other people get to define, he'd said. And I have never once met a person outside this station who understood what secure actually needed to mean here. So I stopped asking them to define it for me. He died the year Myra turned 24, quietly, at his console, doing an unscheduled maintenance check on a Vantic seed line nobody had asked him to run, 3 years after the Vantik had been formally reclassified as presumed extinct, and the Assembly had, in a brief administrative note nobody else ever read, suggested the holding be moved to lower priority storage to free up space for newer acquisitions. Thomas had ignored the suggestion. He had left a note in the private log instead. In handwriting Myra would recognize the rest of her life. Lower priority is not the same as gone. I am not moving anything until someone tells me, to my face, that no one is ever coming back for it. No one has told me that. I don't think anyone ever will, because I don't think anyone actually knows. Myra had found the note 3 days after the funeral, sitting alone in the archive for the first time as its sole keeper, 24 years old and suddenly, entirely, responsible for a task 3 generations deep with no one left to ask when she wasn't sure. She had read it a dozen times that first week, and then she had gone to the Vantik seed vault, and she had run the germination check her father had died in the middle of running, and finished it, because it had felt, at the time, like the only thing she could do for him that would actually mean anything. She had run it every 6 months since, without fail, for 9 years, until the night the signal came and she found herself grateful, in a way she had never quite let herself feel before, that neither her father nor her grandmother had ever once trusted a committee's definition of what was worth keeping. She called Yeth at what was, for him, an unreasonable hour, and he answered anyway, which told her something about how the message had already started rippling upward before she'd even finished composing it. His face on the screen looked the way it always looked, unhurried, faintly amused, the expression of someone who had shed every old anxiety 40 turnings ago and saw no reason to grow a new one now. Keeper Kesa. It is very early. We received an activation ping. Vantik catalog code, 9 digits, repeated broadcast pattern. It matches a return request signature. Something crossed his face, brief and hard to name, and Myra realized with a small jolt that it was the expression of someone trying to remember something they had never actually been required to memorize. The Vantik, he said slowly. Remind me of the details. Homeworld destabilized around 90 years ago. Star instability, then full collapse. Their diplomats deposited a genetic and cultural archive here before the last colonies went dark. Status was updated to presumed extinct 40 years ago, when nobody had heard from any Vantik settlement in half a century. And now something is transmitting their retrieval code. Now something is transmitting their retrieval code. Yeth was quiet for a moment, and Myra watched him do something she had genuinely never seen him do before. He looked uncertain. I will be honest with you, he said. I do not know what condition that archive is in. I have overseen this facility for 11 years and I could not tell you, without checking, whether that specific holding was even still viable. Species archives that old are frequently. It's viable, Myra said. He blinked. You have checked already. I don't need to check. I run diagnostics on the full biological archive every 6 months. I've run them for 9 years, because my father ran them for 30 before me, because my grandmother started running them from the day this station had power. Every seed line in that archive has been re-germinated and re-banked at least twice in its life cycle to keep the genetic material fresh. Every data record has been migrated across 4 generations of storage format. I could recite the Vantik Cultural Index from memory if you asked me to, in their own dialect, badly, but correctly. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. That was never required of you, Yeth said finally. The minimum standard is simple storage. Prevent decay. That is all the regulation asks. I know what the regulation asks, Myra said, and she said it without heat, because she had learned a long time ago that there was no point being angry at a species that had built an entire civilization around the idea that memory was a burden to be set down. It's not what my grandmother promised. Yeth looked at her for a long moment, and something in his ancient, unburdened face shifted, very slightly, toward a kind of attention he had not been giving this conversation a minute earlier. Send me everything you have, he said. I will bring it to the regional desk this morning. If this is real, we will need protocol I am not sure the Assembly has ever actually used. The regional desk's answer took 9 days, and it was, true to form, a masterpiece of institutional caution. The desk had confirmed the signal's authenticity within hours. That much, at least, moved quickly. A Vantik vessel, small and badly patched, had been detected on the edge of surveyed space, broadcasting the retrieval code on a loop, along with a general distress signature that suggested critical life support failure. Estimated crew, unknown. Estimated survivors, unknown. Point of origin, consistent with a set of coordinates the assembly had long ago written off as empty, because the Van-Tick system there had gone dark decades earlier and nobody had checked since. What the assembly had not done, in 9 days, was commit to anything beyond confirming that a problem existed. Yeth relayed the situation to Myra over a secure channel on the 9th day, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "There is a procedural question," he said. "The retrieval clause assumes a formal request from a recognized government or successor authority. The Van-Tick have neither. If this is a handful of survivors, and the projections suggest it may only be a handful, there is no established process for returning a full cultural and genetic archive to an unrecognized remnant population. Some on the regional desk are arguing the material should simply be held in trust indefinitely, pending review, which could take years." "Years," Myra repeated. "Their ship is broadcasting a distress signature." "I am aware." "How many people are we talking about?" "Unclear. The vessel's mass and configuration suggest a very small crew complement. 10. Perhaps fewer." Myra closed her eyes for a second. 10 people. Maybe fewer. The entire surviving weight of a species that had once had colonies scattered across half a dozen systems, riding toward a station that held everything else they'd ever been, while a committee somewhere decided whether the paperwork was in order. "I want to bring the archive up to transfer-ready status now," she said. "Not after review. Now. If they're in critical failure, they may not survive a procedural delay." Yeth hesitated, and Myra understood the hesitation for what it was. Not disagreement. Something closer to a species-level inability to feel the weight she was feeling. To an Osheran, urgency without full institutional sign-off wasn't reckless so much as simply unfamiliar, a shape of behavior that didn't fit any turning he'd ever lived through. "I cannot authorize a transfer without assembly clearance," he said. "You know this." "I'm not asking you to authorize a transfer. I'm telling you I'm going to have it ready the moment you can. That's not against regulation. That's just doing my job well." Something in his face changed again, that same flicker of attention she'd seen days before, and this time it lingered. "Do it," he said quietly. "I will push the desk as hard as I am able. I find that he paused, choosing the word carefully, the way a species without old grudges sometimes had to reach for language other species kept close at hand. "I find that I do not want this to be lost to a committee. I did not expect to feel that. I am not certain what to do with it." "Welcome to the feeling," Myra said, not unkindly. "We've had it a while." She spent the next 3 days moving through the station with a focus that felt almost physical, a weight settling into her chest and staying there. She pulled the full Van-Tick biological archive from cold storage, ran verification on every seed line, cross-checked every genetic record against the modern preservation standard. She rebuilt the cultural index into a transfer-ready format, checking every translation twice, because a mistranslated word in a language nobody else alive could read anymore was not a mistake you got to correct later. Lib flagged her sleep schedule twice on the 2nd day and once, gently, suggested she was pushing herself the way her father used to, which was not, Lib pointed out, a compliment on either of their behalf. "He finished what he started," Myra said, not looking up from the console. "That's the compliment part. He also collapsed twice from exhaustion doing it. I have the logs. Wake me up if my heart rate does something interesting. Otherwise let me work." On the 2nd night, she opened her grandmother's private notebooks again, the paper ones, the ones Ili Kesa had never trusted to a system that could be wiped with one command, and found an entry near the back she hadn't read in years. "The assembly thinks this job is about storage. It isn't. Storage is easy. Anyone can put a thing in a box and leave it there. The job is about believing, every single day, that someone is going to walk through that door and ask for it back, even when every rational sign says they won't. You have to keep it ready the way you'd keep a room ready for someone you love who's coming home late. Not because you're sure. Because you love them." Myra read it twice, and then, because it was 3 in the morning and something about the entry had loosened a thought that had been sitting unexamined in her for years, she got up and walked the long way around through the biological wing instead of taking the direct corridor, past case after case of things that had outlived the people who made them, and stopped in front of a shelf near the back that she visited more than any other, though she'd never told anyone why. It wasn't part of the official Van-Tick catalogue. It was a small wooden box, hand-carved, water-warped at one corner, tucked behind the formal archive boxes where an inspection drone's camera would never quite catch it. Her grandmother had logged it in her private notebooks, not the station's official system, under a heading that had confused Myra for years until she was old enough to understand what it meant. For when they come back. Not for the assembly. For them. Inside, wrapped in cloth that had been replaced every decade so the original wouldn't rot, was a scattering of small personal items. A child's toy, worn soft in a way that only comes from small hands holding it through years of a life that had since ended. A folded piece of fabric with a repeating woven pattern, the kind of thing Myra imagined had once hung in a doorway or been wrapped around shoulders on a cold evening. A short recorded message, in a Vantic dialect nobody at the assembly had bothered to keep a working translator for anymore, though Myra had one. She'd built it herself, over a slow winter, 12 years ago, for no reason she could ever fully explain except that it had felt wrong to keep something you couldn't understand. She had never played the message. It hadn't felt like hers to play. She closed the box gently and went back to her console, because there was work to do, and because for the first time in her life, the work felt like it might actually matter to someone other than herself. The assembly's clearance finally came through on the 13th day, and it arrived only a few hours ahead of the ship itself, which meant the last stretch of preparation happened in a scramble that felt, to Myra, uncomfortably close to the very delay she'd been trying to avoid. The Vantic vessel came into scanning range that evening, and it looked exactly as bad as the distress signature had suggested. It was old, patched in places with material that didn't match, the kind of ship kept alive by people who had run out of parts a long time ago and had learned to make do with whatever was left. Its running lights flickered unevenly. Its transponder repeated the same 9-digit code, over and over, the way it must have been repeating it for weeks or months, a single stubborn thread of hope thrown out into empty space with no way of knowing if anyone would ever hear it. Someone had heard it. Myra stood in the small observation bay of Repository 7 and watched the ship crawl closer on the display, and felt her hands go cold despite the station's steady climate control. Yeth arrived on the shuttle an hour ahead of the Vantic vessel, along with 2 junior assembly officials Myra had never met, both of them carrying the particular nervous energy of people about to be present for something they didn't have a procedure for. Clearance had come through only that morning, after Yeth had, by his own quiet admission, spent most of 2 weeks doing something that did not come naturally to him, pushing, repeatedly, without letting the matter rest, past the point where an Oshiran would normally have simply let an unresolved question settle into the next turning and be quietly released. "I told the desk," he said, watching the approaching ship with an expression Myra had never seen on him before, that if the Vantic died waiting for a committee to define their legal status, the assembly would have failed at the one duty it actually claims to take seriously. I am not sure that argument moved anyone by itself. I am fairly sure the fact that I have never made an argument like it in 11 years moved a few of them regardless. The Vantic ship docked with a shudder that ran through the whole station, its hull groaning in a way that made Myra wince. When the airlock finally cycled open, the first thing through it wasn't a person. It was smell. Recycled air pushed to its absolute limit, the sharp copper tang of a life support system running on fumes. Then came the survivors. There were 8 of them. An elder, moving slowly, supported by 2 younger Vantic who looked barely old enough to be called adults. A child, no more than 6 or 7 by whatever the Vantic equivalent was, wide-eyed and silent, clutching the sleeve of the woman beside her. The rest was somewhere in between, hollowed out by a journey Myra couldn't begin to imagine, all of them wearing the specific, careful stillness of people who had spent a very long time being afraid to hope. The elder stopped a few paces inside the station and looked around at the corridor, at the archive shelving visible through the open doors beyond, and said something in a dialect Myra recognized instantly, because she had spent a slow winter 12 years ago building a translator for exactly this moment, on the small chance it would ever come. This is real. This is really still here. Myra stepped forward before she'd fully decided to, and answered in the same dialect, her pronunciation careful and imperfect, learned entirely from recordings decades old. My name is Myra Kesa. I'm the keeper. Everything you left here is still here. All of it. The elder, his name, she would learn within the hour, was Sarel, and he had been a young man, barely older than the 2 supporting him now, when he'd helped load the last of the archive onto a transport ship 91 years ago, stood very still for a long moment. Then his legs gave out, not from weakness but from something else entirely, and the 2 younger Vantic caught him before he hit the floor, lowering him gently instead, while he pressed both hands over his face and made no sound at all. Yeth watched this from a few steps back, and Myra saw him do something she had never once seen an Oshiran do in her life. He looked, for a moment, deeply and personally unsettled by the size of what he was witnessing, as if some old cultural instinct in him was reaching for a turning that had no equivalent for grief this specific, this long carried, and finding nothing there to hold on to. 9 days ago, he said quietly, mostly to himself, I told you this job was decency, extended a little longer than most would bother. I do not think I understand what I was looking at anymore. They gave Sarel and the others a full day to rest before beginning the formal transfer, though rest turned out to mean something different for people who had spent 91 years believing everything they'd ever been might already be gone. Myra found the elder in the observation bay before dawn, station time, standing at the viewport, looking out at nothing in particular. She brought 2 cups of something warm, not sure if Vantic biology could tolerate it, and set one down within reach without comment. You built the translator yourself, Sarel said, without turning around. His pronunciation of standard was slow, careful, clearly relearned from old recordings the same way Myra had relearned his language from hers. Nobody was required to do that.
No.
Why did you? Myra thought about it honestly instead of reaching for something easy to say. Because it felt wrong to keep something I couldn't understand. If I was going to be responsible for it, I wanted to actually know what it was I was responsible for. Sarel turned to look at her then, and something in his weathered face, older than his years, she understood now, aged by loss rather than time, settled into something that wasn't quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood as one. When I was young, he said, I thought this place was a formality, a box we were required to fill out before our government's inevitable end. I did not think anyone would keep it. I certainly did not think anyone would keep it well. He paused. I have spent 91 years assuming that everything we left here had been quietly lost or reclassified into some archive of curiosities nobody would ever open again. I made peace with that. I had to, or I could not have kept going. And now I am standing in a station where a woman built a translator in her spare time so she would know what my grandmother's voice sounded like, on the small chance that someone might one day need to hear it. Myra didn't have an answer for that, so she didn't try to find one. They stood together in silence for a while, watching the stars, and it was, in its own way, the most honest conversation she'd had in a long time. He asked her, eventually, about the station itself, how she lived, whether she was truly alone here, whether it had always been just one keeper at a time. She told him about her grandmother's arrival, about the crate of tools and the paper notebooks, about her father and the germination checks and the small, unglamorous rituals that had shaped 3 generations of a family none of the Vantic had ever known existed until 9 days ago. Sarel listened to all of it with the particular attention of a man cataloguing, without meaning to, exactly how much he had underestimated the people who'd kept his species' memory alive. On my world, he said quietly, we had a saying, before the end. Grief is a debt the living owe the dead, and it is paid in remembering, not in tears. I always thought it was a beautiful sentiment. I did not expect to see it practiced by strangers who had never met a single Vantic before we walked through that door. We didn't do it for a saying, Myra said. We did it because someone had to, and nobody else was going to. That may be the same thing, Sarel said. Said differently. The child was the one who found Myra next, later that same morning, standing very small and very solemn at the edge of the archive's main corridor, watching Myra work with the particular unblinking focus children reserved for adults they haven't decided how to feel about yet. Her name, Myra had learned the day before, was Ithy, and she was the only one of the 8 survivors who had been born after the last Vantic colony had gone dark, which meant she had grown up entirely inside a ship, with no memory of a sky that wasn't a viewport, and no understanding of what it meant to have a homeworld beyond the stories the adults around her told to keep something alive that none of them could show her. Are you the one who kept everything? Ithy asked, in standard this time, careful and a little formal, clearly a phrase she'd practiced. I am, Myra said, crouching down so she wasn't looking down at her. My grandmother started it. My father kept going. Now it's me. Why didn't you stop? When nobody came for so long? It was, Myra thought, exactly the question every adult in the room had been too polite to ask out loud, and she gave the child the same honest answer she would have given anyone else. Because stopping felt like deciding you weren't coming. And I didn't have any way of knowing that for sure. So I decided to believe you were, instead, and just keep going until I found out I was right or wrong. Ithy considered this with the total seriousness of a 7-year-old weighing something enormous. You were right, she said finally, as if delivering a verdict. I was, Myra agreed. I'm glad I was. The girl reached out, hesitant, and touched the sleeve of Myra's jacket, the way you might touch something to confirm it was really there. Then she smiled, quick and bright and entirely unguarded, the first smile Myra had seen from any of them since they'd come through the airlock, and ran off down the corridor to find her mother, leaving Myra crouched there for a moment longer than she needed to, blinking hard. The two younger Van Tick who had supported Sarel the day before, siblings named Oral and Fess, found Myra later that morning in the archive itself, moving quietly between the shelves with the wide, careful eyes of people walking through a museum built entirely out of their own family. Oral, the elder of the two, stopped in front of a case of preserved textiles and stood there so long that Myra finally came to stand beside her. "That pattern," Oral said, pointing without quite touching the glass. "My grandmother wove that pattern. I have seen pictures. I did not think I would ever see the actual cloth." "It's yours," Myra said. "It's been yours the whole time. I just kept the light on." Oral laughed, a short, startled sound, half disbelief and half something warmer. "You have a strange way of describing 91 years of work." "It didn't feel like work most days," Myra admitted. "It felt like waiting. I just didn't know what I was waiting for until you walked through the door." The formal transfer took place on the third day, once Sarel and his people had recovered enough to stand through a process neither Myra nor Yeth had bothered to make into a ceremony. The morning began quietly. Myra walked the 8 survivors through the archive's main hall, past shelving that ran floor to ceiling in every direction, each case tagged and lit and catalogued in a script most of them hadn't seen written by anyone but themselves in 91 years. Sarel moved slowly, reading labels with his fingers as much as his eyes, pausing at intervals long enough that Myra learned to simply wait beside him rather than hurry him along. Oral cried twice, quietly, without apology, in front of a case holding nothing more remarkable than a set of cooking tools, and Thess put an arm around her and didn't say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. Yeth stood a little apart from all of it, the 2 junior assembly officials flanking him with their tablets out, ready to log the formal handover the moment it began, and Myra noticed, without quite meaning to, that he had stopped checking his tablet entirely and was simply watching, the way you watch something you don't yet have the right instincts to properly understand. "I have overseen 11 transfers in my career," he said quietly, when Myra passed close enough to hear him. "Reclassifications. Consolidations. Once, an actual repatriation, to a colony that had merely relocated rather than died. I have never seen anything that looked like this. What does this look like to you?" He considered the question with unusual care. "I am not certain my language has a clean word for it. In Osharan, the closest concept translates to something like unpaid debt, finally settled, except that phrase implies resentment, and I see none here. Only relief. I think perhaps your language has a better word than mine does." "We just call it keeping a promise," Myra said. "Yes," Yeth said slowly, as if turning the phrase over to see how it caught the light. "I believe that is precisely the word I was missing." It was Myra who first noticed something was wrong, less than an hour into the process, as the formal cataloguing moved from the outer shelving toward the deep archive at the heart of the building. The primary storage chamber, the one that held the full physical archive, the seed banks, the artifacts, the original recordings, 91 years of careful, unglamorous maintenance, had been running a routine structural integrity check as part of the transfer prep. The reading that came back made her stomach drop. A seal on one of the deep storage housing units, original equipment from the station's earliest construction, had been slowly failing for months. Nothing in the day-to-day diagnostics had flagged it, because the failure was happening below the sensor threshold, a slow creeping degradation in a support strut nobody had thought to check because nobody had ever needed to think about it before. It had chosen, with the particular cruelty of old machinery, to finally give out during the highest stress operation the chamber had performed in 91 years. The floor shuddered. An alarm Myra had never once heard outside of drills began to wail. "Seal failure, Deep Archive, Section 3, the station's voice reported, flat and calm in the way emergency systems always were, as if calm could somehow make the words less true. "Atmospheric breach imminent. Automated containment engaging." Myra was already running. Yetha's voice came over the comm, sharp with something that was, for him, close to panic. "Kesa, the automated protocols will seal that section in 90 seconds. Get clear." "The seed archive is in Section 3, Myra said, not slowing down. "The automated seal will hold pressure. It won't stop the temperature drop. Cryogenic failure in that section means the entire genetic bank is dead in under 10 minutes. Then it is lost." You cannot risk yourself for material that can be. It's not material, Myra said, and something in her voice made him stop mid-sentence. It's the only copy of a species that just walked through my front door. I am not standing here and watching it die because a 40-year-old seal picked today to fail. She hit the manual override at the outer hatch with both hands, and the door groaned open against the automated system's protest, servo straining, the whole mechanism screaming a warning she didn't have time to listen to. The corridor beyond was already thick with condensation, freezing fog pouring out through the failing seal, visibility dropping to almost nothing. Myra grabbed the emergency cold chute from the wall rack, didn't bother with the full checklist, just shoved her arms through the sleeves and sealed the chest clasp as she moved, because every second she spent being careful was a second the temperature dropped further. Behind her, she heard Sarel's voice, and turned to see him standing at the hatch, his two young companions on either side. You do not have to do this alone, he said. I do, Myra said. You don't know the chamber layout. I do. Stay back. If that seal goes fully, I need this hatch clear to reseal behind me. She went in. The primary seed vault was at the far end of the section, past rows of shelving already fogged white with frost, the automated backup cooling straining to compensate for a breach it hadn't been designed to handle. Her breath came out in visible clouds inside the cold suit's open collar. The temperature display on her wrist reader was falling faster than the emergency systems could fight it. This was the part her grandmother's notebooks had never fully explained, because it wasn't something you could explain. It was something you did. 91 years of decisions nobody had asked her family to make, small and unglamorous and utterly unrewarded, and every single one of them had been leading, without anyone intending it, to this exact moment. Because Ili Kesa had never trusted a single point of failure. Not once, not ever. In 91 years of maintaining an archive nobody checked on. Myra reached the vault, hands shaking with cold, and pulled open a panel that wasn't on any official schematic, because it had never been part of the official design. Behind it sat a second, smaller cryogenic unit, self-contained, independently powered, built by her father 20 years ago and quietly maintained by Myra ever since, a full redundant backup of the entire Vantic genetic archive that existed nowhere in the Assembly's records at all. For when they come back. Not for the Assembly. For them. She'd thought that note had only ever meant the wooden box. She understood now it had meant everything. The backup unit was small enough to carry, barely, its outer casing already frosting over from the ambient cold. Myra wrapped both arms around it, felt the weight of it settle against her chest like something alive, and turned back toward the hatch just as the failing seal gave a final, grinding shudder and the emergency bulkhead began its full closure sequence, claxons rising to a scream. She ran. She made it through the hatch 4 seconds before it sealed, stumbling into Sarel's waiting arms, the backup unit still clutched against her chest, her cold suit rimed with frost, her lungs burning from air that had been thin and freezing for too long. Behind the sealed bulkhead, the primary vault's temperature continued to fall, and there was nothing left to do about it but wait, and hope the automated systems eventually stabilized what they could. Sarel lowered her gently to the floor, his hand steady despite the fear Myra could see in his face, and looked at the frost-covered unit in her arms. What is that? Everything, Myra said, her voice raw, teeth chattering. It's everything. I have no idea if the primary vault survives. I don't care right now. This one will. Sarel stared at her for a long moment, and then he did something Myra hadn't expected. He laughed, a short, cracked, disbelieving sound, half a sob riding underneath it, and pressed both hands over his face again, the same way he had in the corridor the day before. 91 years, he said, muffled through his fingers. 91 years I told myself not to hope, because hope was a luxury we could not afford. And you built a second copy. In secret. That nobody asked for. Because you thought we might come back. My father built it, Myra said, still catching her breath. I just kept it running. That, Sarel said, is precisely my point. The primary vault, when the emergency engineers finally cleared it 2 days later, had lost perhaps a third of its material to the temperature failure. It was, by any reasonable measure, a serious loss. Nobody treated it as one, because the backup Myra had carried out of the freezing corridor with her own arms held everything intact, down to the last seed, the last strand of genetic material, the last translated word. The formal transfer took place 4 days after that, once Sarel and his people had recovered enough to stand through a ceremony neither Myra nor Yeth had bothered to make grand. There were no speeches. There was a table and boxes, and a room full of people who understood exactly what was changing hands and did not need it explained to them. Myra brought out the small wooden box last, the one that had never been part of the official catalogue, the one her grandmother had kept behind the formal archive where no inspection drone would ever find it. She set it in front of Sarel and stepped back. He opened it slowly. The child's toy. The folded fabric. The old recorded message. "I built a translator for that recording 12 years ago," Myra said quietly. "I never played it. It didn't feel like it was mine to hear." Sarel looked up at her, and for a long moment he didn't say anything at all. Then he reached into the box, lifted the small recorder, and pressed it into her hands instead of his own. "Play it with me," he said. "You have earned the right to hear it as much as I have. Perhaps more." The recording was short. A woman's voice, warm and tired, speaking to a child who would grow up to be an old man standing in this room 91 years later. Myra didn't understand every word. Some of the dialect had drifted even from what she'd studied, but she understood the shape of it. A mother, in the last stable days before everything fell apart, telling her son that whatever happened, he was loved, and that love like that didn't disappear just because the people carrying it eventually did. When it ended, the room was quiet for a long time. Administrator Yeth stood near the back, and when Myra finally looked over at him, she found him watching the whole scene with an expression she had genuinely never seen on an Oshran face before, something that looked almost like grief for a turning he had never lived through and would never fully understand, and beneath it, something that looked like respect that had nowhere established to put itself. He filed his report to the regional desk 2 weeks later, and Myra only saw it because Sarel, staying on temporarily while the Vantic remnant decided where to rebuild, forwarded her a copy with a short note attached. "You should see how they are describing you now." The report was longer than anything Yeth had ever submitted about Repository 7 in 11 years of oversight. Buried in the careful, formal assembly language was a recommendation that would, over the following months, quietly reshape how the keeper posting was assigned across every archive station in assembly space. It suggested, gently but unmistakably, that the position be reconsidered, not as a minor administrative duty handed to whoever a species could most afford to lose for a decade, but as something closer to a sacred trust, and that species capable of sustaining unsupervised, multi-generational commitment without institutional enforcement be given priority consideration for future postings. It did not use the word humanity directly, not at first. It didn't need to. Within a year, 3 other archive stations across assembly space had human keepers assigned, not as an afterthought this time, but by direct request, some of them accompanied by letters from other displaced or dwindling species who had, quietly and independently, begun asking whether the strange, forgettable species who'd been given the porch to sweep might be willing to sweep theirs too. Myra read Yetha's report standing in the same observation bay where she'd first spoken to Sarel, and found she didn't feel triumphant about it, not exactly. Mostly she felt something quieter, closer to the feeling of finishing a long piece of work and setting it down carefully, the way you'd set down something that mattered. Sarel left 3 months later, when the Vantic remnant finally settled on a resettlement site, a modest colony world the Assembly had helped secure once it became politically convenient to be seen helping. He came to say goodbye in person, standing in the same observation bay one last time, older than he'd looked the day he arrived, though Myra understood by then that some of that was simply the weight coming off him rather than settling deeper. "We will build something," he said. "Small, at first. It will not look like what we were. It cannot. Too much time has passed, and too few of us remain. But it will have Ithy's grandmother's pattern woven into something again. It will have our language spoken by more than 8 mouths. It will exist, which for 91 years I did not believe would ever be true again." He paused. "I wanted to ask you something before I left, and I have been putting it off because I was not sure how to phrase it." "Ask." "Would you come visit us? Not as the keeper. Not in any official capacity the Assembly would ever need to record. Simply as the person who kept us waiting for 91 years without ever once letting us actually be lost." He smiled, small and genuine. "Ithy has already decided you are her favorite person in the galaxy. I do not think that opinion will change quickly, and I do not see any reason it should have to." "I'd like that," Myra said, and meant it entirely. He left the next morning, and the station felt different afterward in a way Myra hadn't fully expected. Not empty, exactly, because it had always been just her and Lib, but quieter in a new register, the particular quiet of a room that has recently held more people than it usually does and remembers the shape of them. She went back to the archive afterward, because there was still work to do, There was always work to do. That had never been the part that changed, and found the wooden box sitting empty on the shelf where it had always been kept, its contents finally home with the people they belonged to, the space where they'd waited now open for whatever came next. She didn't fill it with anything new. Some things, she was starting to understand, were meant to stay empty for a while, ready, in case someone else out there was still finding their way home. On the day the Assembly formally reissued the Keeper Regulation for Repository 7, expanding its charter, increasing its funding, elevating its status in every way that mattered to people who cared about such things, Myra filed the new documents the way she filed everything, carefully, completely, without fanfare, and added one small handwritten note to the private log her grandmother had started 94 years ago, in the same spirit, in the same steady hand her father and grandmother had both used before her. Someone came back. Everything was still here. I don't know who's coming next, or when, or whether they'll come at all. But I'll keep it ready anyway. That's the job. That's the whole job. It always was. She closed the notebook, turned off the light behind her, and went to check on the seed banks one more time before sleep, the way she had every night of her life, the way someone in her family always would, for exactly as long as it took.